Another target of this insane imperialist violence is Venezuela. The Trump administration's a growing aggression towards Venezuela continues to escalate. They've got U.S. warships now surrounding Venezuela and the Caribbean, B-52 bombers, fighter jets, and they're promising military strikes by land, like land military strikes, in addition to what they've already been doing, which is just these extrajudicial assassinations, killings of fishermen, basically in these small boats off the coast of Colombia and Venezuela that have already killed at least 57 people. So I want to show a couple clips of our dear leaders discussing this stuff. First, we've got this tweet actually by the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, which sadly I can't actually read that tweet because of the way it looks. But he's basically, I mean, the gist of it, I'll paraphrase it. I mean, that what you see is an image that he was proudly displaying of the military strike on one of these boats. This is a tiny boat. And he claims in this tweet that they're actually like saving Americans from drug trafficking, and they've killed drug traffickers. I mean, last I checked, drug trafficking is not a capital offense, one. And two, they've given us no evidence that these people are drug traffickers. They just have killed 57 people, some of whom have, I mean, there's a few people on these boats who've actually survived who weren't drug traffickers. No evidence anybody has been. Zero due process here. It's just completely horrific and criminal what they're doing. And then I wanted to play, before we bring in our guest, a clip of, we've got Florida Senator Rick Scott and Senator Lindsey Graham saying some words about what they'd like to do to Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. So let's play that.
If I was Maduro, I'd head to Russia or China right now.
Because?
His days are numbered. Something's going to happen. Whether it's internal or external, I think something's going to happen.
What do you think removing Maduro would signal to other socialist regimes?
It'll be the end of Cuba. America is going to take care of the Southern Hemisphere. And we're going to make sure that there's freedom and democracy.
The examples you're citing also involved ground troops. You said time for Maduro to go.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot like regime change. Are you talking about troops on the ground?
I'll let the president speak to that. I'm talking about a briefing that would expand military operations potentially from the sea to the land. It is time for Maduro to go. It was time for Ortega to go. The Monroe Doctrine has been robustly applied by President Trump.
I mean, a lot to talk about there. So joining us to discuss it is José Luis Granados Ceja, Mexican journalist with Venezuela Analysis. Jose, welcome to the Freedom Side Live.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
So before we get into too many specifics, I guess I wanted to just give you the opportunity to respond to these latest escalations, just your general thoughts about the cruelty and criminality we see taking place by this U.S. administration.
Yeah, it's actually quite difficult to overstate just how terrible, dangerous, unpredictable the situation is as a result of U.S. actions throughout Latin America. Yeah, I know we're talking about Venezuela. Obviously, Venezuela is in the crosshairs right now, but I've been stressing the fact that this isn't just about an attack on Venezuela. And this isn't just an attack on Colombia. It's an attack on all of Latin America. What we're seeing is a very aggressive United States as part of its efforts to try to regather its forces, to concentrate its attention here in the Western Hemisphere, to build itself back up in order to be able to once again dispute global hegemony, incredibly violent, incredibly aggressive, no regard for international law, no regard for even its own constitution. Everything that we're seeing is clearly illegal. As you well said, 3 UN experts also echoed this. These are extrajudicial killings, and they should be very clear about what these actually are. We have to specify that as many times as necessary, that this is a huge act of illegality, that we're dealing with basically a rogue government that's acting the way that it feels like it can get away with this impunity. And actually, I was just listening to the beginning of this segment. Of course, right? The entire system of international law has been dramatically weakened, if not virtually destroyed, as a result of the genocide against the Palestinian people. And so I think it's really important that the governments of the region, but also the peoples of the region, realize the danger that we're facing here. It's actually kind of difficult to predict what the consequences of this be, but you've just showed these two clips. These actors, these violent criminal actors who call themselves political representatives, are now playing with fire. If they really do go through with this, it will, on the one hand, establish a terrible precedent of just simply deciding and labeling a political enemy in the region a drug trafficker and then throwing the door open to any and all actions. We're talking about potential strikes inside of Venezuela, a massive violation of the sovereignty of Venezuela, but also we're talking about potentially, targeted strikes, a hit on Maduro. I mean, it would unleash chaos, not just in Venezuela, because we have to remember this. People seem to think that they've fallen for so much of this propaganda that there aren't revolutionaries in Venezuela. Of course there are. Not only are they revolutionaries, but the state is well armed, well prepared. It is prepared for this scenario. And we're seeing the population respond in a very impressive way, mobilizing themselves, joining up the militia if they weren't already members, access to weapons. This is going to lead to a very dangerous situation that would obviously go beyond the borders of Venezuela and create a real regional crisis, which is why the region has to respond in a united way. I know there's lots of lackeys here, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Noboa in Ecuador, Milei in Argentina. All of them are playing Washington's games, but this is very, very serious, and we have to put a stop to this.
I think it's super important to just keep underscoring how serious this threat is, and especially what you're getting to about what it means for the region. So I did want to ask you, how has the region responded as of now? You've also been talking a lot over the last year about Trump possibly escalating towards Mexico. Is there any fear right now in Mexico about what this could mean for Mexico as well? What has kind of been this regional response, and how do people see it implicating for their own countries as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, the response has been mixed. Like I said, there's these lackeys, there's these people who'd rather kind of throw themselves before the feet of the empire, hoping that somehow that will save them. We have to remember, a friend of mine from media here always says, Alina Duarte, the United States doesn't have friends, it has interests. And these countries that are aligning with the United States are doing so at their own peril. And I think really run the risk of eventually being betrayed, because as soon as it's no longer convenient, the United States and its leadership, Democrat or Republican, are going to dump you. And I think they're really, really playing a dangerous game here. I'm really worried about what's happening in the Caribbean in particular. You have to remember, these are small states. There's a reason CARICOM is such a powerful regional organization, because only tonight, united, are they actually able to kind of push their weight around in terms of international politics. And we see, for example, like I said, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago kind of going against CARICOM. And have to remember, Venezuela was very generous to the Caribbean states. The only reason it isn't today is because of U.S. sanctions have punished its economy. And so, they don't have these preferential deals and the access to oil. But Venezuela would absolutely restart Petrocaribe if it had the opportunity to do so, if they were able to get U.S. sanctions off of them. There have also been really positive examples. We saw a statement from various political leaders from throughout the region, published by the Progressive International, talking about the need for a united response for the region to step up. I've been, historically a huge proponent of CELAC, but I think CELAC in this instance has actually failed us. There's this insistence of wanting to have always consensus, and the fact that I think the presidency pro tempore is always rotating weakens its ability to become a forceful actor in the region. This is the moment where we need these kinds of institutions to step up and to actually defend this region as a zone of peace. That's not just a saying. That was a unanimous agreement here, and the United States is representing a direct threat to that. As for Mexico, I think we're already seeing this creep towards Mexico. The second to last attack, so there was one yesterday, but there was one on Monday. And the one on Monday actually happened so close to Mexico that when the United States Armed Forces detected that there had been survivors, they had alerted the Mexican search and rescue team, because it was probably the only country that was capable of actually sending a team out that was in the region. They say it was about 800 kilometers, 400 miles from the coast of Guerrero near the city of Acapulco. So that shows that it's already coming close. And of course, Trump has gone onto the record saying that he wants to do precisely these kinds of strikes that are happening now on these boats. Yes, in Venezuela, inside land, but also in Mexico, that he regrets not doing it in his first term. There are some very dangerous hawks inside of his government who want to attack Mexico. They feel like that is the solution. It's that kind of, attitude that we see so much amongst US policymakers that, a hammer blow can solve everything. Obviously it won't, and it would destroy the bilateral relationship. I actually think that some of the more sensible people inside of the White House right now realize that violating Mexican sovereignty in that fashion, a unilateral military strike on Mexico, would obviously be a red line for us and would destroy the bilateral relationship, and we wouldn't have the cooperation that they need. You have to remember that the United States, their number one trading partner is Mexico. They need us for migration issues. They need us around drug interdiction. And if they play with fire, then they're going to see a response from this president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who has been very clear that this is a non-negotiable. And if they do go that far, they're going to see that not only does the president have a firm line on this, but the population does, and that they're willing to defend the president, including whatever negative outcomes may come to us as a result of that. This is a population that will not tolerate sovereignty as the violation of its sovereignty, as they won't in Venezuela, as they won't in Cuba, as they won't in Nicaragua, and all these countries that are currently in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism.
So on that note, I do have a kind of multi-pronged question for you. I mean, I guess all my questions are multi-pronged, but I'm just warning you ahead of time. There's two parts of this question. One is, I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how the Venezuelan people so far are responding in terms of like mobilizing, in terms of self-defense, that sort of internal response. Are they afraid? Are they kind of are they kind of coming, rallying around the flag type of situation? I imagine even Venezuelans who, aren't pro-government are probably like, well, I don't want the U.S. to bomb my country. I mean, I'm sure that sentiment exists somewhere, but usually people don't like to be bombed. So that's one side of this question. And then the next aspect of that is I think about the way that the U.S. is so arrogant when it goes on these military adventures, and they think everything's going to be a walk in the park. And given that there is, an internal preparation inside Venezuela, which you're going to tell us about as a part of this multi-pronged question, walk us through realistically. I mean, I know you can't tell the future, you don't have a crystal ball, but realistically, is it just a walk in the park if the U.S. wants to do a rock war in Venezuela?
So on the first bit, we just published a column by Clodovaldo Hernandez, and he put it really well. Sure, things are on high alert, but people aren't falling into the trap of alarmism, of being too worked up about this. And of course, part of that is because Venezuela has gone through a revolutionary process. There's something called the civic military union in Venezuela, and that's actually a term that came up as a result of the rescue of Hugo Chavez in 2002 in the coup that actually temporarily ousted him from power for about 48 hours. He was rescued by the armed forces, but the armed forces decided to act because they saw the population on the street. And it's something that's deeply ingrained in Venezuela society, that there isn't this kind of division between the armed forces and the population. And it's specifically in the case of Venezuela, they do have a militia. So they have an organized militia where volunteers can sign up to be part of this, emergency response branch of the armed forces. And of course, the armed forces themselves operate under a very different doctrine. They operate under an anti-imperialist doctrine, which was implemented by Hugo Chavez. And so they've been preparing precisely for an invasion for decades now. And so they're very much prepared. Would this be a walk in the park? Absolutely not. And of course, as you rightly point out, what you've seen actually is that even some of the critics on the left and to the right of Maduro have closed ranks because they understand that there are some things that cannot be violated. Of course, the country's sovereignty, the integrity of its territory is not something that can be negotiated. And so you're seeing a rallying around this. I will say there are some who are calling for more military action by the United States and more pressure and are welcoming these aggressive actions by the United States and these bombings. It's the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Maria Corina Machado, who represents the hard line of the opposition. A lot of people have been led to believe and been, fooled by this propaganda campaign that they've been on over the last few months now, to think that she is the only representative of the opposition. In fact, she was largely a marginal figure. Her profile has obviously grown over the last year or so, but she is not this, unifying figure. People do not agree with her in terms of this. Even people who may want to see Maduro leave office are not going to support bombs raining upon them. Opposition journalists have also said, you're reminding some of these people who are calling for an attack, that these bombs won't distinguish between Chavistas and opposition supporters, they'll fall on everybody quite the same. And no, of course not, it wouldn't be a walk in the park. I mean, what it would be an incredibly dangerous situation. I really want to remind people this, I have to stress it. We're dealing with a population that has a revolutionary consciousness. They are not going to accept Maria Corina Machado in the presidency. They will not tolerate that. It's quite likely that you would have a very dangerous situation on the ground, up to and including a bloody civil war with Venezuelans killing each other because of U.S. intervention. This is what they're playing with. And of course, like I said earlier, this would have regional implications. This would obviously go beyond the borders of Venezuela, would probably produce a migration crisis that would reach the doorstep of the United States. This apparently is the most important issue for this administration. They're playing with fire here. This would not be easy. They will not be welcomed as liberators, as they tried to tell us with the same lies as they did with the invasion of Iraq many, many years ago now.
Well, I think that's a really great point to make, and something we've been talking about too, Rania, just about how the U.S. and Donald Trump is so obsessed with this migration crisis, and the Venezuelan migrants have really been at the butt of a lot of his attacks and these policies. This villainization of Tren de Aragua, the deportation of 250 Venezuelan migrants, yet they want to create another regime change war that would most definitely generate thousands and thousands of people having to flee their homes. But that's not what I wanted to ask you. I wanted to end on a positive note because, this is not happening with no response. You said the response of the region has been a little lukewarm, but I think what we've seen from the people of Latin America and the Caribbean, and really the world at this point, is a very strong stance in defense of Venezuela. So can you tell us a little bit about how people across the world are responding? What are solidarity movements doing and saying? And, does this give you hope?
My faith is always in the masses and be able to respond to this. They are the drivers of history here, and we've seen a very good response. I always highlight actually some of the words of João Pedro Steli from the Landless Peasants Movement, the MST in Brazil, who's very clear. He's like, if they attack Venezuela, we're going to organize internationalist brigades. And of course, that's absolutely the right response. And he says, we're going to send back those soldiers in coffins. Of course. And shouldn't be a controversial take. We're not going to allow U.S. boots on our territories. Full stop. And so the populations of Latin America understand this. We have a very, very long, vivid history of U.S. intervention. A lot of this feels familiar, not just Venezuela, right? But, this U.S. sanctions campaign that's deliberately trying to destroy the Venezuelan economy. They've basically performed miracles there trying to rescue their economy from the punishing effects of these sanctions. For those of you who don't know, it's the dominance of the US dollar that makes it virtually impossible for Venezuela to sell its oil on the international markets in a simple way. They have to go through intermediaries. It's very complicated, and obviously there's discounts. And so, Venezuela has taken a hit as a result of these sanctions, but they've endured. Now, that reminds me so much of, Kissinger's comments about Chile, about making the economy scream. It's a very same kind of logic. And of course, this is only the latest effort at trying to oust Maduro. We've seen the Guaido circus. We saw, now the support for Maria Corina Machado, the Guarimbas, these violent protests in 2014, 2017. It was an insurrectionary strategy by the opposition to try to oust the government there. And so they're very familiar with this here. But like I said, also in other parts of the world, the United States is a very uncomfortable neighbor for us. And we've gone through various political cycles where peoples have realized the implications of a close alliance with the United States, and we're just not in favor of it anymore. In the case of Mexico here, we are the number one trading partner, but obviously Mexico's also looked towards developing its South-South relationships with other countries here in the region and beyond, and there's a very different world. This isn't, the early 2000s where the United States could try to push its weight around. There is a very highly developed consciousness amongst the populations here. So fortunately, we have seen the response. But I do think that we can't stop. We have to be relentless about our organizing around this. They've seen some domestic criticism, a handful of U.S. politicians kind of drawing attention to the fact that the U.S. is basically engaged in another war without having gone to Congress. And that pushback is important, but we have to keep pressing, particularly inside the belly of the beast, because right now, stopping this has to happen in conjunction with actions inside of the United States to make it clear that even Trump supporters don't want another war. He sold himself to the population as the peace president, as someone who was going to avoid getting into another armed conflict. Well, Right now, because he's listening to Marco Rubio, who's listening to the Venezuelan opposition, who's feeding them all of these lies about what's happening in Venezuela, letting them think that this is actually going to be a successful strategy, well, they're about to start another war that not only will make a heightened conflict in South America, but it'll change the mood in the entire region against the United States, even more so than it already is today.
Well, we will definitely be keeping an eye on this story. We don't really have much of a choice because they just keep sending American military equipment to the Caribbean as they allow children in America to go hungry because of priorities. Jose, I want to thank you so much for joining us, Mexican journalist with Venezuela Analysis. We really appreciate you, and we will definitely be discussing this with you again soon, unfortunately, but also fortunate to have you.
Absolutely. Anytime.